Hello everybody, and welcome back to a little bit more Wildstar coverage. I am not quite ready to be doing my Judge Mathis of the series quite yet, as I'm still putting in quite a bit of time into it. But one of the things I definitely wanted to cover and talk about for those who are interested is the dungeon system of Wildstar and the differences between something along the lines of World of Warcraft and something like Wildstar. There is quite a stark difference between the two, if you ask me. The dungeons in Wildstar are much more difficult and require a lot more attention and focus, and for that, I'm very happy. So, what this is going to be covering is Stormtalon Lair, one of the very first dungeons you can get a hold of. At level 22, different dungeons unlock, both Stormtalon Lair and Kelvor. Is it Kelvor or Kelver? I'm not entirely sure what the second one's called. I've actually only done the final boss of the second one because I was pulled in after the tank of the party ended up leaving. But Stormtalon Lair I have done 6 or 7 times now. It seems to be the most popular of the two, and for good reason. I've had a really good time going through this dungeon quite a bit, and the more I've done it, the better I've gotten at tanking. Tanking is a totally different beast than it is in something like World of Warcraft, and I've had a really good time with it. Now, initially, I wasn't a big fan of the warrior tank, but I think it was just me kind of learning the class and learning the mechanics of the game itself before I really understood how it worked. I'm running one add-on during this, and you're going to see it up in the top left corner of my screen when we are fighting, and that is Threat Meter. For anybody who's playing this game, I highly suggest grabbing the Threat Meter add-on. Add-ons are 100% supported, so it's really easy to get add-ons for this game, and Threat Meter is really, for me, the only one I've ever needed so far. It just lets me know where I'm standing as far as threat and making sure that I am pulling the threat that I need to be, and if anybody's getting really close, I know who to keep an eye on to drop a taunt down pretty much as soon as possible. So, one of the things I talked about early on in the first impressions video for Wildstar was the combat system of Wildstar and how the telegraphed, action-packed combat system is woven throughout the core of Wildstar's design. And that really carries over into Wildstar's dungeons. In fact, that's where I'd say the combat system shines. My very first time going through Stormtalon Lair was an exciting experience. To the point where the very first pull we ended up wiping 3 times on. It was interesting to wipe super hard on the very first pull because in other dungeons and of other MMOs, trash mobs are not something you really worry about. They're just the thing that stands between you and the boss, and you just go through them as fast as you can. I mean, I remember playing World of Warcraft, and one of the main things that I would do was just run through the first 2 or 3 rooms, pull as many mobs as I could, and then with my friend with me, we you know, and then a good party member, we were able to just go through trash mobs as quickly as we could without really worrying about danger. That mentality does not carry over into Wildstar, even remotely. The first pull and majority of the pulls in this game are no more than 2 or 3 mobs at a time, and they are designed to work in tandem with one another. So the first pull that you have is something called a Stormtalon Sentinel and a Stormtalon Shaman. The Sentinel is a beefy melee attacker who every so often does this jump attack that will knock everybody down and whose white damage is pretty powerful. They do a lot of damage. And the Shaman does decent white damage, but her thing is that she'll once in a while cast a spell called Rejuvenate. And what Rejuvenate does is basically in a very short amount of time fully heal the Sentinel and the Shaman. And because the Shaman hits, I mean the Sentinel hits really hard, people's initial thought is to burst down the Sentinel as fast as you can. Once you learn that the Shaman is starts casting Rejuvenate, you then realize to focus the Shaman down. Makes sense. But one of the other things you have to realize is that you can't just burst down the Shaman before she casts Rejuvenate. She will cast Rejuvenate at least 2 times during that fight. So you need to learn to time your interrupts, and I mean time them. This is something that some parties will kind of get down really quickly. Other parties it might take a little bit to figure out, especially pugs. And the reason I say that is because when someone sees somebody casting Rejuvenate, it's instinct to just cast your interrupt. And one of the parties I had before was and we just actually, I ended up dying right here, as you're gonna see, to a just a pull that I ended up taking too much damage on. But one of the gut reactions is to everybody cast their interrupt, and everybody will use their interrupt. That's a problem because now everybody's interrupt is on cooldown, and so when the Sentinel is doing his attack, nobody can interrupt him, and you're just all gonna have to get out of the way, which buys him time to live, which buys the Shaman more time to cast Rejuvenate, because now you're not attacking them so often. So you kind of have to learn these patterns, and this is the same with all of the mobs. Now, after going through this dungeon about 6 or 7 times, you know, I don't have that much trouble anymore, and anybody who's new in the dungeon, I can kind of explain to them pretty easily how certain mobs work, or how bosses work. But for the most part, you know, especially if it's your first time, there's going to be a learning process there. There's about 4 different trash mobs throughout the entirety of Stormtalon Dungeon that you're going to be going through. There's the Sentinel and the Shaman. Then there's the Wind Fury or something or other guy who comes with 2 bird ads. He does a lot of charging attacks. The birds can be knocked down and dealt with. He just has to be avoided. He's pretty much tank and spank. He's not very difficult. And then there's something that looks like the Void Walker from World of Warcraft. Now, he's one of the most powerful pulls in this dungeon. And he's just a trash mob. Now, what you have to do with him is you need to make sure you pull him alone, because he takes a ton of damage. He does a lot of AoE telegraphed attacks that do a bunch of damage, and he likes to charge whoever he has the highest aggro on and leave a giant red trail in his midst that does AoE damage over probably like 10-second times. So you have to constantly be moving. There's a lot of kiting involved with him. There's a lot of movement involved with him, and it's a lot of fun. So that's the trash mob aspect of the game. The trash mob aspect of the game requires coordination from the party more than any other trash mobs in the game. Now, the boss fights in the game are something really special, and I'm going to show you all 3 boss fights as I go through them and talk about each one. The one we're coming up on right now that I should be cutting to, or we should be getting ready to go into, is the first boss of the game. There are 3 main bosses in this dungeon and 2 side bosses. The side bosses are, I call them side bosses, but they're not really side bosses. There's just 2 special mobs in the game that you can fight, and they're mildly difficult, but we're not really going to talk about them because they're just tank and spanks and the DPS the adds on. But as you can see, the very first boss is this big guy who has 4 channelers around him. Every so often in phase 1, what he'll do is he'll do this giant X-shaped AoE attack that you need to get out of the way from. If you stand in it, you're going to take a lot of damage, and you're going to end up wiping, especially if you're a squishy healer. Chances are you're going to take a lot of damage. Now, during the boss fight, the party needs to be incredibly focused on working together, and that's really important, especially between the tank and the healer. The tank and the healer desperately need to be close to one another. And the reason for that is that as the tank, even the white attacks, the regular attacks of bosses, will take off probably 1/4 of my health. So I need to be available and near the healer at all times, so he can throw heals at me very easily while still keeping an eye on the party to make sure they're not taking any damage. Now, as a tank, if I'm doing my job, the only thing that the party needs to worry about is the telegraphed attacks, and they shouldn't be taking all that much damage. But every once in a while, you'll have a tank that might not be able to hold the aggro as well as another one who might not have as great a gear. But either way, as a tank, particularly as a tank and a healer, you want to make sure that you two are remaining pretty close and that you are moving kind of together so that he always has you in his sights. Phase 2 of the fight is when there needs to be a little bit more kind of coordination. So what happens is that the main boss becomes invincible, and the 4 channelers around him need to become the targets. You need to take them out so he's no longer invincible. During this fight, a player will randomly have a red target kind of focused on them. It'll move with you until it locks in place. Once that red circle fills out, it locks in place, and then it will once again fill out a second time. What the player wants to do for that is to bring that red circle over to the channeler, and once it locks in place, move out of the way. The reason for that is that the lightning strike that hits once that red circle channels through the second time actually does damage to the channeler. So it's like a quick nuke that you can drop on the channelers themselves. Also, every time you take out a channeler, these wisp-like things, these lightning wisps, start rotating around the map. Every time you take out a channeler, more and more of them show up, and they will persist through the 3rd phase of the boss fight. They don't do a lot of damage, but they stun for a really long time. So you just kind of have to keep an eye on them and avoid them as best you can while you're taking out the channelers. It's really not a high damage phase, it's actually kind of an easy phase, and for a first boss, it's actually pretty simple. Once all the channelers are dead, you're going to then be fighting the boss himself. The boss himself in phase 3 has it's a similar idea. I ate that attack and I shouldn't have right there. Similar idea. He keep him focused on the tank. Every once in a while, he'll do that lightning strike that fills out a red circle that you were doing throughout the phase 2. And then he'll do an AoE that's much, much bigger than the AoE telegraphed attack in phase 1. There are 4 essential safe spots that you can run to during that. Run to them, avoid the wisps, and avoid the channeled attacks, and you should be good. Again, if the tank is doing his job, you shouldn't have to worry about his white attacks. He should be able to take those white attacks, and for the most part, the party should be focusing on any channeled or stunned attacks that he is dropping down and getting out of the way of the AoE attacks. He's a pretty straightforward boss, but once you get the idea and the hang of him, but for going into this dungeon the very first time, and when you think about, you know, dungeon bosses in something like WoW, where it's usually tank and spank, there's actually a lot of coordination involved. Now, for this dungeon, 3 of the 5 party members had never done this dungeon before, and I was able to explain the fight to them before we went into it, and luckily, we were able to take him down in the first try. Very, very simple boss. They got it down really easy, and they did a great job working together. It's very important, too, if you've done dungeons like this before, to keep in mind that you're going to come across party members who may not have necessarily done this before. So you're going to want to be patient. Wipes are going to happen, especially probably on the second boss, which we'll jump to here in a moment, and we will talk about in a second. And you're just going to want to, you know, just be patient, and it's a learning process for everybody. So that when they go in the next time they do the dungeon and they come across people who have done it before, they can help explain the boss, and it's just a cycle of learning. It's really fun going into these dungeons early on in an MMO's career, just because you are one of the first to experience this stuff. And for a dungeon like this, it's well designed, and it's a lot of fun. As far as actual like aesthetics of it, I would say that this dungeon in particular is not nearly as cool looking as the other dungeon that I saw a little bit of. The other one is like a giant forge, essentially, and it's way, way cooler looking. But this still, Stormtalon's Lair still looks really cool. So between this and the next boss is about a room of pulls. There's about 4 or 5 pulls that you need to go through. There's going to be sentinels, and there's going to be the wind callers or whatever it is. But one of the cool things that's within this is there's a little area that you get to jump up to that unlocks another hollow crypt. It's essentially a res point if the party wipes. So one of the good things that these dungeons do is they give you checkpoints, essentially, that you get to go to if you end up wiping, knowing full well that you might end up wiping. So the next boss, which we'll skip forward to here just a little bit, and I'm going to cut to it right now, is essentially an elemental. He looks like kind of like a Void Walker in WoW. He is basically a special looking Void Walker in WoW. And I think at the point I ended up recording this was the one where we ended up killing him. Much like the boss before him, he has 3 phases. Phase 1 is pretty simple. He's a tank and spank. You go up to him, you grab aggro as a tank, and you let the party DPS him. He actually hits really, really hard. So it's very important that you and the healer are close. As you can see, I'm constantly dropping down in my health, and I'm doing everything I can, dropping AoE, defensive things, dropping walls, to try and mitigate the damage that I'm taking. Once you DPS him farther down enough, he'll split into 3 aspects. Those 3 aspects can be knocked down, can be interrupted, can be stunned, but they do a fuck ton of damage. It is incredibly important as the tank to grab the aggro of these 3 things, and then it is incredibly important for the healer to make sure that the tank is staying alive. It is very easy for the tank to die during this phase. Once all 3 are wiped down, you get knocked back to the beginning of the room, and the tornadoes that were sitting on the side of the room start going back and forth. And you're gonna get red circles kind of thrown around on the ground that are gonna be lightning strikes. You have to get to the boss as soon as you can because he is charging an attack that will one-shot you. So your goal is to get from the beginning of the room back to the boss and throw down an interrupt. It's gonna take 2 interrupts to actually knock him down because he has an interrupt armor. Once he gets knocked down and interrupted, it's back to fighting him like you did before, with the exception that he's going to hit just a little bit harder this time. So it's repeat of phase 1, where you are DPSing him down until he splits into 3. He's going to have a couple of AoE attacks that he didn't necessarily have in the first phase, and then once he splits, it's the same thing. The tank needs to grab the aggro of those 3 units, and you're going to need to basically focus them down as fast as you can. Once again, tank should be taking a lot of damage here, so the healer needs to be doing a lot to make sure he's alive. Pretty simple so far. Once the 3 adds are down again, which they should be down pretty shortly here, as you can see, I'm doing a very good job at being able to hold the aggro. You will be knocked back to the beginning of the room, and once again, you're going to have to run up to the boss. The only difference between this phase and the last phase is that after you interrupt him, the tornadoes don't stop circulating through the room. They continue doing what they were doing. You're going to have to avoid the tornadoes and the lightning strikes, all while DPSing him down, so it just creates a little bit more chaos, and that's kind of a running theme for Wildstar's bosses, is just every phase is just a little bit more chaotic and a little bit more difficult. But we were able to interrupt him there. He was getting really close. I don't know why they were taking so long to drop their interrupts, but we got him. And I can't remember if I die. I think I do. But luckily, before I die, I'm able to drop that reduced damage area that people can sit in. I did what I could to mitigate my damage. All my cooldowns were down at that point. There's nothing I could do. But luckily, he was low enough where we were able to finish him off in this burst, I believe. Once he's down, you can go ahead and res everybody. The tornadoes disappear. And you don't have to worry about anything else. And he drops some loot, which is kind of cool. It's a good boss. I really like him. He's actually my favorite boss in this dungeon just because of the chaos that ensues. I would say he's also the hardest boss in this dungeon. In my opinion, the final boss is quite simply the easiest of the 3, but he's a lot of fun as well. And there is around this room, you're going to want to go around and make sure you loot everything up. Make sure you click on the things that create optional quests for you, or finish off optional quests for you, and mine if you can. I really do love that boss. He is a lot of fun, and the bosses themselves of this game are really, really good. It's really easy too, and this happens a couple times, I probably should point out, for party members to accidentally pull mobs. It's very important for you as the party member to be careful where you're pulling and make sure the tank is pulling. The reason for that is this is not where an MMO where if you pull an extra mob, you're going to be okay. You just might take extra damage. If you pull an extra mob, you're most probably looking at a party wipe. You want to make sure that the tank is pulling pretty much everything to ensure that you're going to be okay. If you are not letting the tank pull, you're doing it wrong. Just make sure he gets the aggro initially and he can set up the mobs in the direction he needs to face them. That's especially true with the sentinels and the shamans. You need to make sure that me as a warrior tank in particular, I need to make sure I have them both within my melee range. The thing with the shaman is she doesn't come to you. She's a ranged attacker, so you kind of can't drag her to you. You need to make sure that you go to the shaman and then drag the sentinel to you so you can keep them both in your cone. And then once that's all set, you can kind of DPS them from there and interrupt them from there, so on and so forth. So the last boss, which we will swing up to, and then I'll give my final thoughts on the dungeon so far, is Stormtalon himself. He's a cool little dragon that actually has a pretty simple idea to him. So essentially, the way he works is he will do a frontal cone attack automatically. That is his basic attack, and the tank should be taking that every single time. He will also be dropping AoE attacks, or he'll target players with this very small AoE telegraphed attack that'll strike lightning. And then every once in a while, he'll knock the party back, and he'll stun them. And then once you're out of your stun, you need to run up to him and interrupt him so he does not do basically a giant one-shot on the entirety of the party. You do this a few times until he moves into a second phase, which you should see here in a minute. As you can see, it's very simple. Just move out of the way and make sure the tank has the tank has the aggro. And the party's doing a very good job too when I move, because I'm getting attacked, to shift with me. And that's, again, really important, particularly in this game. When I move as the tank, or when the tank moves, make sure you're shifting accordingly. You do not want to be in his frontal cone AoE and taking unnecessary damage, because then the healer has to drop down heals that they may not have the focus mana or time to drop when he's focusing on the tank. So just shift with the tank. My party did a very good job at shifting with me as I moved around to avoid those lightning strikes so I didn't get knocked down and take unnecessary damage. So this is phase 2 essentially. What he'll do is he'll pick a player to be the eye of the hurricane. And in a very small area around that player, it will be a safe zone essentially. So the party needs to stick towards that player. That player is also going to need to move, because he's not only is he the eye of the hurricane, so to speak, but the Stormtalon is also going to be dropping those AoE lightning bolts in rapid succession on that player who is the focus of the hurricane. So that player is also now forced to move, which means that safe zone is also going to move with him. It's good to set up a contingency because during this fight, that Eye of the Hurricane thing is going to happen more than once, and he will target random players. Now, we were lucky that he targeted me more than once, so everybody was pretty close to the tank as it was. But it's good to set up a contingency to, basically let the party know which direction you're going to move. Let them know which way before the fight starts, like, hey, if I become the Eye of the Hurricane, let's all move counterclockwise, so the party can react very quickly. Again, I think we wiped once before this particular round, but it was just kind of a learning process for some of these guys. But once we got it down, it was very, very easy. The healer did a very good job at sticking with me. The party did a very good job at staying near me, but far enough away where that frontal cone attack was not going to do any damage. Now here, I'm trying to wait last minute to move out of the way so that the healer had time to drop heals on me. And luckily, that's where we're able to wipe him. Because we wiped a few times, we actually got a bronze medal. There are different medals. You can get gold, silver, bronze for each dungeon. The better the medal, the better the loot. So there is incentive to run the dungeons over and over again. And it gives you some neat little rankings, like I was number 5 in staying alive, and number 4 in damage, and number 4 in heals. Makes sense, right? Because, I'm a tank. I'm not doing a ton of damage and this, that, and the other. But with that said, that's pretty much that aspect of the dungeon. I did not show the 2 optional bosses because, like I said, they're just kind of harder mobs. There's nothing really special about them. But what I want to say is that especially for early dungeons, I have been having a blast. My favorite way to play these theme park MMOs is to dungeon grind, is to play the dungeons, and especially to be a tank. I love tanking dungeons. And Wildstar does an absolute phenomenal job. They really, really do. Like I said, the telegraphed and action-packed combat system is the center of Wildstar's world, and it really, really shines in its dungeons. It requires work. It's very hard. My first time going through Stormtalon took me 2 hours. I was learning to tank. I was learning how the mechanics worked, learning each mob pull. But the learning process was really fun. And luckily, after that learning process is done, the execution is still just as fun. So it's not boring to go through these dungeons again. And it really particularly shines if you go through with friends or a party that you know, or you luck out and get a pickup group that works incredibly well with one another. Obviously, your mileage may vary depending on the pug that you get, but for the most part, you're going to have an incredibly fun time. And dungeons so far in Wildstar have been absolutely phenomenal. They have been the most fun I've had in a dungeon since Wrath. Wow. And a lot of the stuff that you might get in like a raid of WoW is present in 5-mans. The coordination is necessary, and the teamwork is necessary. It is really, really well done. So big ups to Carbine. I'm still having an absolute blast playing this game. I'm looking forward to running some more dungeons maybe later tonight. I might stream it. You'll see an announcement on YouTube if I do. If you guys have any questions about Wildstar, make sure you drop them in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more content just like this, and consider dropping a like if you did enjoy it, as it helps me out a great deal. And as always, I'll see all you guys next time. Bye-bye.